In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a simple ambient occlusion effect. All we've got here are a couple of text objects, a single light, a floor, and a sky, and the ambient occlusion effect turned on in our render settings. And we get this really great, well, I'm going to call it a global illumination hack. It looks very much like a much slower render process, and it looks pretty good in my opinion. So to create this, go ahead and create a new scene in Cinema 4D. And start by adding some MoGraph text. So use the MoGraph text object to do that. In the Object tab, type in the word occlusion. Hopefully I'm spelling that correctly. There's a decent chance there's only one C. I might be wrong here. Change your font from Helvetica, or whatever it happens to be, to Impact, something nice and chunky. And change your alignment from left to middle. So you now have some center-aligned text. And increase the depth to 200, something nice and thick. Next, duplicate that text object and change the text from occlusion to ambient and make it a little bit thinner. So I'm going to make the depth 100, so exactly half of the other. And I'm using all caps for my type so that it rests more plausibly on top of each other. I'm going to take this other text, rest it right on top of the first, and then I'm going to select both of them, go into my cap settings, and add fillet cap to both the start and the end, and I'm going to turn on constrain so that my caps follow the edges of my text. Now when you use the constrain option, you have to be careful not to use too large a rounding setting because you can get some pinching in your corners. And the next thing I want to do is ensure that there's overlap with all of my letters and the floor. Looks like that is good. I'm now going to add a floor object to my scene. And I'm realizing also that my caps need a little bit more, a little more steps. So select both of your text objects again, and change the number of steps in your cap setting to something like 5 to improve the quality of the round. Give that a quick render. What we've got is a fairly flat looking render. Well, maybe not flat, but it doesn't look very good. So to solve that, I'm going to add a light to my scene, and I'm going to call this light ambient. Now, it's not important that you rename the light, but it does make it a little bit easier to understand what's going on. Now, a regular light, when you place it in your scene, comes from a specific direction and shades your objects accordingly. If in your light settings you turn on something called ambient illumination, it creates a light that is coming from all directions at all times for all objects. And in our case, that makes our entire scene white because everything is being illuminated equally from all directions. To give our objects a sense of shading again, we're going to turn on something called ambient occlusion. And what it does is it takes the ambient light, right, that light that's everywhere, and it occludes or blocks it. A good way to think of that is an object, you know, out in bright sunlight with the sky around it. Only those like deep cracks and crevices are going to be dark. Everything else should be pretty bright. And that's what ambient occlusion allows us to do, is add self-shadowing. So go into your render settings, which you can get by pressing on that third render button. Go into the effect option here and choose ambient occlusion. Now with just the default values, if you render, we've got a pretty good looking piece of 3D text. If you add a sky to your scene, things are pretty consistently white. You've got this cool looking infinite background. Now if you want to add a little bit of variation, you can change the color of your ambient light, and it's going to change the color of all of the objects in your scene. So you might choose something like a cartoony orange. And we've got a white sky. If you want to give the sky a little bit of color, you can just throw a material on it. I'm going to choose a blue. Put that on my sky. Render again. And to improve the look, I'm just going to change my camera angle to a much lower one, so the floor and the sky are pretty much flush. Render that. And that is a quick overview of how to use ambient occlusion to create a global illumination style of rendering without the massive render hit.